Robert of England. Robert of England. Robert of England! Yes, it sounded just as sweet every time. Somewhere on a remote island in the Pacific Ocean, a small canoe ground into the beach, its lone passenger breathlessly announcing the news to another elated tribe. He deserved as much, the village elder surely nodded. Perhaps the news had not spread as far as Robert imagined, but the English certainly knew of it. Hence their innocent billhooks were kept unusually sharp, for a French king was not to be tolerated for long. Robert was one step ahead of them though. He had taken into account the secret route to any Englishman's heart: promise to kill the Welsh. Yes, he would press Kingmaker Edwin the Bold's claim on some petty kingdom of Britain's mountainous annex, pleasing both the most important vassal in the realm and giving all true Englishmen a chance to exercise their pride. It also just so happened to make his Kingdom of England that little bit bigger and more glorious. Did I mention that he was King of England? He would have wanted me to make that quite clear. He couldn't risk his own troops in this war given his precarious tenure in Westminster, but a quick word to Paris ensured that the French army was at his beck once again. By now, King Philip was probably starting to see through Robert's mystique, but a king's word was rather scrutable, and hence was kept at great expense to all those would-be scrutinizers. The Welsh and their allies were dispatched at little cost to Robert, but there was some adjacent trouble in the southwest. The Fraticelli cult had driven the people of Wiltshire into a frenzy. They were armed to the teeth and demanding the redistribution of the church's hypocritical hoards of wealth. Best have them killed, the bishops of the land agreed. Eager to stamp about the country to mark his territory, and to hunt the most dangerous game of all, Robert set out to slay his people. En route, the peoples of Gloucester saw their chance to rise up as well, ambushing Robert's army at Winchcombe. They achieved little, for the army was actually in a state of battle readiness at all times on account of tension between the commanders of its two main contingents, English Duke Edwin and French King Philip. Their troops had fought each other in the past, and weren't entirely shy of doing so again. When war cries were heard in the night, both factions emerged from their tents, smugly revealing that they had been sleeping in chainmail for just such an occasion. They began battle with the attackers, each presuming these ragged raiders to be their treacherous allies, and fighting with a righteous fury and pride that left little of Gloucester's anti-Robert brigade. The light of day revealed what had really happened, and everyone laughed, their eyes fixed on the nearest mace. These men would be keeping each other's awkward company for months and years as they besieged the many fortresses of northwest Wales. The king they were fighting for paid them not even a single visit, for he had returned to his loyal 500 in Maine in order to see off attacks made by allies of ailing Gwynedd. He was also eager to check in with his court in Maine, relocated from Rouen due to some more nasty business with the surprisingly extensive network of Welsh sympathisers. He found Regent Adeline to be in good spirits, on account of all the bothersome lords being off on campaign. Their reunion produced for him another son, bringing him up to 3 children by 3 different mothers. The spirit of William the Bastard lived on indeed. By virtue of having a whole kingdom to tax, Robert had saved up a little money. After a stressful few years, it was definitely time for a treat. He splurged out on a second duchy, creating all the regalia, heraldry and precious metal accessories required for him to call himself the Duke of Gwynedd. Since Gwynedd was mostly administered by the Duke of Mercia, this meant nothing at all in practical terms, and for precisely that reason, people were willing to humour the king's new claim. That said, perhaps humour is not the appropriate term, for plenty in England saw nothing funny about the king wasting the crown's purse in pursuit of vanity. In fact, the Duke of Wessex, one Edwig of Somerset, sent word to Rouen that he was formally recognising the Duke of Northumberland, one Edulf of Bamber, as King of England. Confuse yourself not with Edmund or Edwin, 2 of the other leading dukes of the land. These Englishmen hadn't made it easy for Robert, had they? Once the initial panic subsided, Robert breathed a sigh of relief. Edwin was the powerful one, and he was still loyal. So while Northumberland, Wessex and Kent declared a new English king had emerged, the better part of the realm remained intact. The question now was, could all this trouble be solved without Robert leaving his room in Rouen? He awoke one morning to the sight of Adeline, Bava and Mare at the foot of his bed, all proclaiming that they were bored and wanted to go to England themselves. Robert wryly asked how they knew each other, and recoiled at the balls of spit that were sent his way in response. Apparently, the new pressure group in Rouen was Betrayed Mothers Against Robert, and they were going on a trip to Mercia to visit Princess Agatha and her famous dagger collection. With this, the king rushed to war to be among heavily armed and at least somewhat loyal company. He met up with the Duke of York, just in time to see him do battle with the Northumbrians. All the advantages were on Robert's side, and victory was soon won, but that wasn't the real struggle. That came when Duke Godwin asked where the promised monies from France were. Oh, did they not load them off the ships? Oh, have the ships already sailed back? Oh, what a bother. Just hang on, they'll probably realise their mistake and come back soon. The tale would see a few additions in its many retellings to each duke and count Robert met, including in one case a claim that the devil had rendered the gold invisible. The troops would have to fight Robert's war without pay then, and for one reason or another, Robert's army never swelled to be quite as big as he wished. In fact, when the great host was all gathered, it was smaller than the rebel force currently besieging Westminster. The money situation was only going to get worse if Robert waited for Philip to obligingly send more men, so into battle his armies went. He only needed about a third of his force to die to balance the books, perhaps less if he looted his own dead and sold the equipment to his own levies. While writing to Rouen to assess the demand for helmets with decorative arrows lodged in them, a messenger arrived from the far north. The letter, in no uncertain terms, was a declaration of war from the Duke of Lothian, vassal of England's noisy neighbour, the Kingdom of Scotland. The sheer amount of invisible gold Robert professed to know about needed to be a lot greater to sort this mess out. The good news was that about 500 metres outside of the tent in which Robert cursed through tightened lips at an exhausted Scotsman, the battle was progressing well. Robert was lucky to have Edwin of Mercia commanding his force, for his cunning quickly overcame the enemy's numbers. The rebels had amassed a great number of horsemen in their centre. Edwin sent his own smaller cavalry force out to fight them before they rushed back towards Robert's camp. Seeing a chance to turn the flight into a rout, the rebels pressed forwards. But alas, before the camp's perimeter was Edwin himself with some 1,200 infantry. The fleeing cavalry were let through to the rear, but then the footmen drew together into closer order, presenting a solid wall of shields to the rebels. The rebels found their horses quite afeard of the sudden obstacle, and then more so of the arrows Edwin's men began releasing over and through the grid of shields. After enduring many injuries, and seeing no way to continue on through the loyalist formation, the rebels were routed themselves. Edwin did not pursue, instead rushing to his right to smash the flank of the rebel left wing. They were set to routing also, joining the rebel right wing, which was already a good mile on their way to anywhere but that battlefield. Westminster was saved. Some days later, King Philip agreed to declare war on Lothian. England was saved. Some weeks later, the young Countess of Anjou passed away, her lands and wealth being left to her king. Robert was saved. After some laborious choreography, Robert had a ghostly, unmanned ship run aground at a time he had publicly predicted. On board was all the gold he had promised, returned to physical form by God as a sign that he was pleased with the loyalty of the English vassals. Said vassals were almost shocked to feel the coin in their hands. Was Robert actually something more than bluster? England certainly was doing well at the moment, especially with the French fighting the Scottish on their behalf. The English and French together finished off the rebels at Hartlepool. After such overwhelming numbers were presented, the rebel leaders decided to accept a peace treaty, restoring the realm to Robert. That was Northumberland, Wessex and Kent taught a lesson. Who would be next? The Dukes of York and Essex were plotting something of their own, the rumours had it. Indeed, England was full of many talented nobles with the legitimacy to rule the realm, all but one man, the man who called himself king. Thus, there seemed to be no end to the conspiratorial quagmire in sight. Robert was by now quite aware that the throne he had pined for was forever coated in thorns. Welshmen, Scotsmen, Englishmen, his vassals, his former king, his current wife, anyone could be an enemy. The jealousy of humankind knew no bounds before his glories. All these people were like leeches, sucking at his grandeur while cursing him between slurps. At least he wasn't like that, Robert thought, as the French army marched for the drenching autumn of Scotland. As it happened, the Scots had caught a boat down to France, and so when Robert took his army to Rouen for a big I won gala after the harvest, he stumbled into another battle. Edwin the Bold had come along for the festivities though, so Robert was free to slip back into the castle while the Mercian veteran directed the English longbowmen to scatter the Lothian force from afar. There's no place like home, especially when it comes to plotting the murder of your vassals, and Robert was not going to miss this chance. With a little sleuthing, a few private invites for drinks after court, and the spreading about of most of the Anjou legacy fund, he found the Duke of Essex to be not for want of mortal enemies. The conspirators were assembled, the blades were hidden, the squeaky floorboards of Bedford Castle were carefully mapped, and then Duke Edmund only went and died of old age. Ah yes, the Lord God was the greatest conspirator of them all, and he was cheap. Robert dedicated an evening's entertainment to his Holy Father as thanks, and was rewarded for his attentive and pious outlook with another legitimate child. When the child was to be named, he remembered the strange feeling he had got on that night, knowing that he had done the right thing in the eyes of the Lord by spending time with his wife. There was a strange, familiar comfort to such things, a homeliness that Adeline and Bava were lacking. Reminded of quieter times long ago, he named his new daughter after his mother. The new arrival entered a newly peaceful England, the war with Lothian having been completely won. The armies returned home and were disbanded. Robert's enemies had been crushed, and his similarly hostile allies needed to recuperate. For a time, all was well again. Robert spent time in Rouen, showing his bemused son Robert his custom floppy wrist sword-fighting style, telling his precious daughter Solène of all the food and finery she would enjoy as Queen of France when she grew up, and for the first time, making Mère feel like she was at home in Normandy. He ransomed away the contents of Rouen dungeon, and spent the profits on another lavish set of accoutrements that just so happens to make him Duke of Anjou. Triple Duke, triple Count, and King. Robert realised he needed to make sure everyone really appreciated how great he was, and announced a tournament in his own honour. All the great warriors of Normandy and England, and some from further afield, would gather to fight for the amusement of Robert's bloodthirsty subjects. A few high-profile deaths kept the peasants entertained throughout. The same could not be said for Duke Edwin of Mercia, who was forced to sit beside the king and listen to his endless commentary on the so-called mistakes each combatant made in their fighting style, posture, choice of weapon, armour configuration, hair, accent. Well, suffice to say, it was quite the display, and one that allowed Edwin to make up his mind on a certain matter, even long before he told his interpreter to spare him from the king's wisdom.